The Grandin Press on Palmyra's main street is the site of all of the activity of the next couple of months. The printing of the Book of Mormon is going at full speed, and Oliver is preparing the printer's manuscript from the original in order to provide the text for the Book of Mormon printing plates. The printer's manuscript is a lot more polished than the original manuscript. We know this because we have some of the original manuscript, but because we have so little of it, only 18%, we don't know how different those two manuscripts are. The little that we have indicates that they are really close, but we just don't know. The main motivation for having the printing manuscript was that there was a copy so that this could not be stolen or lost, and therefore the work would go forward regardless. But it's also possible that Oliver is making improvements to the original manuscript as he is producing the printer's manuscript. Because it's taking an exceptionally long time to copy the original manuscript, this is not happening at the same rate that the original manuscript was produced. And in December of 1829, we have a letter from Oliver Cowdery to Joseph Smith, basically saying that Joseph Smith Sr. is coming to get Joseph because there's some copyright disputes with Abner Cole, who is printing parts of the Book of Mormon in his periodical because he's using the same press on the weekends. Joseph returns to Palmyra and confronts Abner Cole. This ends in an altercation, in which case Abner Cole backs down on his printing. But there are more problems. The people of Palmyra say that they're going to boycott the printing of the Book of Mormon and not buy any copies. Martin Harris gets worried about his mortgage, and so he gets Joseph Smith to sign a paper basically saying that he gets to sell as many copies as he wants and first so that he can recover his money. This throws the whole project up into the air because Joseph is expecting a big payout, and so are all the other people working hard on this particular printing, particularly Oliver Cowdery and Hiram Smith, who are producing the printer's manuscript and delivering the pages back and forth to Grandin's and checking things and making sure it's all okay. There are other investors too, like Josiah Stoll, and so Joseph has to come up with another way that he might be able to make money, and he leans on the idea that he can sell the international copyright in Canada. And so he sends those four men that we've talked about already, Josiah Stoll, Joseph Knight Sr., Hiram Page, and Oliver Cowdery, to sell the copyright in Kingston. And of course they go there, and this fails miserably. There's a revelation that you can go and see on the Joseph Smith's Papers project and a lot of other information around it, but what we know is that this revelation cut out Martin Harris completely, and also the idea that this was supposed to sell for $8,000, which would return Martin his $3,000, and then give all of those five people, Joseph Smith included, $1,000. When this revelation failed, David Whitmer said much later that he asked Joseph why, and Joseph said, well, some revelations are from God, some revelations are from man, and some are from the devil, and this was from the devil. So this revelation, even though it was recorded, was left out of the 1833 Book of Commandments. It's curious that these men did not abandon Joseph at this particular moment. They actually doubled down on their investment. I mean, they were heavily into the printing of the Book of Mormon by this point, and it was rolling off the press by the end of March. But the idea that the Book of Mormon was going to be a great money spinner and provide a huge amount of funds to these people who were heavily involved in producing it seemed to get a bit of a kickback. So these men doubled down on the veracity of the Book of Mormon as a spiritual text in bringing forth the gospel, and that is why we see the church formed on the 6th of April, 1830. I think there's good evidence to suggest that if the Book of Mormon looked like it was going to be a commercial success, that Joseph would have been just happy with that and living his life in Harmony, Pennsylvania, with his new house and his ability to save his family. But right now he needed to find another mechanism to provide financial support for himself and also for his parents. And people were excited. This was a new movement. This was something grand, and they were willing to sacrifice to see it come forward. And so Joseph was able to utilize that in order to get some resources, at least in the short term, till you could figure out if the Book of Mormon was going to be productive in terms of funds. One of the things that always surprised me when I'm looking at history is the idea that when you're looking back in time, you think that the thing that happened was always going to happen, that it was meant to happen, that maybe even it was prophesied to happen. But when you start to read the accounts, you look at it quite differently and see that the people around the time didn't know what was happening, and that wasn't a guarantee or a thought that this was exactly what was going to happen. Such is the beginning of the Church of Christ, now become the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which was organized on the 6th of April, 1830. So much folklore has been invented around this day, and it's been backdated into the historical record, that it feels like this is really momentous. But when you read the accounts, you realize nobody had that intention at the time. Joseph Knight Sr. tells in his reminiscence that he's taking Joseph back up to Palmyra in March of 1830. Now, Joseph has been in Palmyra in January and February, and we know that that Canadian revelation involved Joseph Knight Sr., so he probably got a ride back to Pennsylvania with Joseph Knight, and Joseph Knight is taking him back at the end of March because now the printing of the Book of Mormon are coming off the press. But Joseph Knight Sr. recounts that he's surprised because Joseph tells him that the church needs to be organized. He also recounts that he gets to Palmyra and sees Martin Harris in a tiz because Martin Harris can't sell any Book of Mormons. They're not selling, and he's really distraught about this. So then 6 men decide to organize the church on the 6th of April. Those men are Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, Hiram Smith, Peter Whitmer Jr., David Whitmer, and Samuel Smith. So essentially 3 Smiths and 2 Whitmers and Oliver Cowdery, who becomes a Whitmer later. And just as an aside, this is an example of Joseph with these 5 others. But you can see they all look like old men, but they're not. They're all basically young adults at this particular point. All those 6 people are really young. And Joseph is getting these revelations at the time to organize this church because it seems a bit haphazard. This is just coming out of basically nowhere, or at least on the back of the Book of Mormon being published, but not selling. Section 21 is the revelation that is about the 6th of April date. And it's curious that this 6th of April is exactly a year from when Oliver Cowdery has put up his money to help Joseph secure a mortgage on the Harmony property. This reads like a partnership between Oliver and Joseph, which is understandable considering the history that they've had over the past year. And David Whitmer is also there because, of course, he's part of that Doctrine and Covenants revelation about Oliver and David forming the church in Doctrine and Covenants section 18. Section 20 is the revelation that most people are acquainted with because this sets out basically the first church handbook. The header says portions of this revelation may have been given as early as summer 1829. Now, this is related to the idea that this is the Articles and Covenants that Oliver got in June of 1829 that is now being repurposed for this church that Joseph is involved in because Oliver thought that he was going to be making the church back 6 months ago. These are all great evidences that Joseph didn't really plan to be in this position, and he's just co-opting what Oliver was starting to plan towards. Section 22 is given on the 16th of April, and it basically says that people need to join this new church by baptism, that they can't rely on any baptism that they've had previously. And again, in hindsight, it looks like this should have always been the case. But if you read it in context and in the time frame, you realize that people are trying to figure out what this new church means and how it is either separate or connected to the wider Christian body that people are engaging in otherwise. And section 23 is a series of 5 really short basically one paragraph revelations to 5 people: Oliver Cowdery, Hiram Smith, Samuel Smith, Joseph Smith Sr., and Joseph Knight, who's also still there, of course, because he's going to transport Joseph back to Harmony, Pennsylvania. Now, something important to realize is that Joseph is doing all of this while lots of other people have no idea that this is going on. One of those people is Emma Smith. She does not know that this is happening. Think about all the time that Joseph has actually been away from home. In the last 6 months, he's gone up to Fayette, New York on the 1st of June. He's been up there right through to the end of September. And then he's gone back up again in January through February. And now he's gone back at the end of March through into April. Emma has been at home tending things, making sure that they're working, that they've got some income, and Joseph is out playing with his friends, with his boys, and making plans that don't include her. This is a boys' club, and it's a club that Joseph and Oliver and perhaps David are forming without any of her input. So this new church is being formed, baptisms are happening. Emma doesn't know anything about it. And 2 really important baptisms happen in April of 1830, and that is the baptism of Joseph Smith Sr. and also of Martin Harris. Because remember, he is distraught about the fact that he can't sell books, and now Joseph is offering him a spiritual salvation through baptism. And Joseph Smith Sr.'s baptism is huge for the younger Joseph Smith. He has been looking forward to uniting his family on spiritual matters, and his dad's baptism is really big. Both Joseph Knight Sr. and Lucy Mack tell the story of how Joseph wept when his father was baptized, that it was so emotional for him, such a relief to have his family now connected in the gospel, in the church, in Christianity. And sometime by the end of April, or maybe even into May, Joseph is back in Harmony, Pennsylvania, and he's now preaching to people in Colesville and South Bainbridge, where Joseph Knight Sr. is, and people are getting baptized there. So in my last video, I talked about April 6th and the beginning of the Church of Christ, and I said that some of the other accounts of people at the time suggest a different trajectory for the formation of the church. And one of those accounts is from David Whitmer, and it's worth listening to it in its entirety. He says that in June of 1829, I was baptized, confirmed, and ordained an elder in the Church of Christ by Brother Joseph Smith. Previous to this, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery had baptized, confirmed, and ordained each other to the office of an elder in the Church of Christ. I was the 3rd person baptized in the church. This is not true. Samuel was baptized before him, but he's recounting this in 1881. In August of 1829, we began to preach the gospel of Christ. The following 6 elders had been then ordained: Joseph Smith, Oliver Cowdery, Peter Whitmer, Samuel Smith, Hiram Smith, and myself. Notice that these are the same 6 for the April 6th meeting. The Book of Mormon was still in the hands of the printer, but my brother Christian Whitmer had copied from the manuscript the teachings and doctrines of Christ, being the things which we were commanded to preach. We preached, baptized, and confirmed members into the Church of Christ from August 1829 until April 6, 1830, being 8 months, in which time we had proceeded rightly, the offices in the church being elders, priests, and teachers, which are the same in the Book of Mormon. Now, when April 6, 1830 had come, we had then established 3 branches of the Church of Christ, in which 3 branches were about 70 members. One branch was at Fayette, New York, one at Manchester, New York, and one at Colesville, Pennsylvania. It is all a mistake about the church being organized on April 6, 1830, as I will show. We were as fully organized spiritually before April 6th as we were on that day. The reason why we met on that day was this: the world had been telling us that we were not a regularly organized church, and we had no right to officiate in the ordinance of marriage, hold church property, etc., and that we should organize according to the laws of the land. On this account, we met at my father's house in Fayette, New York, on April 6, 1830, to attend to this matter of organizing according to the laws of the land. You can see this from section 17 of the Doctrine and Covenants. The church was organized on April 6th, agreeable to the laws of our country. It says after this, by the will and commandments of God. But this revelation came through Brother Smith as mouthpiece. Now, brethren, how can it be that the church was any more organized spiritually on April 6th than it was before that time? There were 6 elders and about 70 members before April 6th, and the same number of elders and members after that day. We attended to our business of organizing according to the laws of the land, the church according to our 6 elders as their ministers, besides a few who had recently been baptized and not confirmed, were confirmed on that day. Some blessings were pronounced, and we partook of the Lord's Supper. I do not consider that the church was any more organized or established in the eyes of God on that day than it was previous to that day. I consider that on that day the first era was introduced into the Church of Christ, and that era was Brother Joseph being ordained as prophet, seer, and revelated to the church. The Holy Ghost was with us in more power during the 8 months previous to April 6, 1830 than ever at any time thereafter. Almost everyone who was baptized received the Holy Ghost in power, some prophesying, some speaking in tongues. The heavens were open to some, and all the signs which Christ promised should follow the believers were with us abundantly. We were an humble, happy people and loved each other as brethren should love. Just before April 6, 1830, some of the brethren began to think that the church should have a leader, just like the children of Israel wanted a king. Brother Joseph finally inquired of the Lord about it. He must have had a desire himself to be their leader, which desire in any form is not of God. For Christ said, if any man desire to be first, the same shall be last of all and a servant of all. He that would be great, let him be your servant. For he that is least among you, the same shall be great. David then goes on to talk about how this act of organizing the church and making Joseph a leader in that church above others caused the eventual downfall of the church, in his opinion, because it went from an egalitarian church to this idea of a leader who pronounced revelations. And he talks about how many of the people, particularly those first elders, pronounced revelations, and none of those are recorded as official church ones, but they were happening, they were prophesying, they were getting revelation, and those things were really important to the early church. He also says, I want the brethren to understand me concerning this error of ordaining Brother Joseph to that office in April 6, 1830. Not at all do I mean to say that I believe the church was then rejected of God. What occurred on this day was this. One of the elders of the church, Joseph, was led into a grievous error, and the members acquiesced to it. In time it proved to be a most grievous error, because the cause of the trouble which afterwards befell the people of God, they put their trust in Brother Joseph and received his revelations as if from God's own mouth. David goes on to say that he heard the voice of the Lord in 1838 telling him that he needed to separate himself from Joseph and the church because it had fallen into error, and Joseph was now a fallen prophet. He also said that if you believed his testimony of the Book of Mormon and his witness as one of the 3 witnesses, that you should also then believe his witness in 1838 that God wanted him to separate, and that you should, if you believed in the Book of Mormon, and you should, because he did, that you should address God through the Church of Christ, which is what it was supposed to be, not the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which it became, and then some of those moved to, of course, Utah and practiced polygamy. So David Whitmer offers a completely different idea of the coming forth of the church, and particularly April 6th as an important date. By the end of April and into May of 1830, Joseph is back down in Harmony, Pennsylvania at his house. There's a nearby Colesville branch, which now includes Joseph Knight Sr., and this seems to be going really well. There is a burst of sales of the Book of Mormon early on, which gives people confidence, but Joseph has deemed the sale price by Revelation at $1.75, and this is approximately equal to $61 in US dollars today, which is pretty prohibitive for a book. It just means that it's not really available to the average person. So along with the boycott that the Palmyra residents are giving the Book of Mormon, Joseph is also having a hard time actually selling them. He's got a missionary force out there promoting it though, and particularly his brother Samuel, who's a really great evangelist. But when you do the numbers, it looks pretty dire. There are 5,000 copies of the Book of Mormon for $3,000. That means each one cost about 60 cents. And then they're trying to sell it for another, effectively, $1.20. So that should be a really good amount of money, but it's just not providing for Martin's mortgage. He's really falling behind quite quickly. He needs to sell a third of those copies in order to recover his investment. And of course, the missionary force who are going out to sell these things also need to figure out a way to provide for themselves, so not a lot is coming back. Joseph subsequently drops the price by revelation to $1.25, and this means that half of the books need to be sold in order to just pay off Martin so that his mortgage won't be foreclosed. And of course, this never happened, and so Martin loses his farm. But in June of 1830, they don't know this yet, so Joseph is busily engaging in his next project, which is his translation of the Bible. Because one of the big things that came out of the replacement text was that the King James Version was corrupt and needed significant improvement. Colby Townsend's done some good work in those Isaiah passages of 1st and 2nd Nephi, and he shows that Joseph is using a biblical commentary, Clark's commentary, in order to make improvements. He's making his own adjustments and his own theological developments, but he's certainly using Clark's commentary as a base. And because Joseph has learnt this technique, he can also do the same thing with the Bible in its entirety, which he's going to do and use Clark's commentary to provide his own translation of the Bible with his own improvements. One of the reasons that Joseph felt like he could make money off a book like the Book of Mormon was there are other texts that were similar, like View of the Hebrews, that talked about the ancient origins of the Native American people. And there were things like Pilgrim's Progress, which talked about how gaining a spiritual understanding of God through a parable could be really popular and really effective. And so it may well have been that Joseph saw the popularity of Clark's commentary and decided with his own understanding he could produce something similar that would be a good money spinner as well. Joseph did not want to go back to farming. It wasn't his passion, certainly wasn't his creative, unique offering to the world. And so this opportunity to engage in the Bible was something that he was really keen on. So Joseph started this project in June of 1830, and we don't know the progress of this or where he exactly started. He probably started in Genesis, and so the Book of Moses was one of those first kinds of revelations attached to his understanding of the Bible that we see, and we don't know exactly who's there, but it's likely that either Oliver Cowdery or John Whitmer is his scribe during this process, because they are around the area and we see some revelations for them very shortly in the timeline. Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible became a really important part of the early church because Joseph was engaging in it throughout the next couple of years, and particularly with Sidney Rigdon, and offering some incredible theological developments to the early church. Joseph produced this pretty slowly because he was running a church, and so this was really piecemeal. But by 1833, it was pretty much complete. But it never got published, and there's some really important reasons why. Firstly, in 1831, in November, there was a conference held about the accusations that Ezra Booth were giving to the church, and the people in the conference, the members of the church, the leaders, decided that they would publish Joseph's revelation to the world so that you could tell that he was getting revelation. They decided there to publish 10,000 copies of these revelations, and this would be done in Missouri because it needed some industry, and W.W. Phelps was there with the printing press, so that would be an activity that could be done in independence. 10,000 copies was pretty ambitious, so that was twice as many as the Book of Mormon. It was actually reduced later to 3,000 because that just was a ridiculous amount. But this project took precedence over the translation. So therefore, these revelations were published in the Book of Commandments and produced in Independence, Missouri during 1833. Joseph Smith's translation of the Bible was to follow that printing. However, of course, we know that the saints were chucked out of Independence, Missouri in the middle of 1833. The printing press was destroyed, and so the Book of Commandments was never quite completed, and of course the translation was delayed. And by the time that Joseph was printing again in Ohio, many of his theological innovations had moved past the things that were in the translation, and so he worked on other revelations, other projects, and the translation of the Bible never got published by him. But an important thing to note is in this November 1831 conference, where they're talking about producing the revelations for the public and then again doing these translations of the Bible for the future, this was all part of a money-making idea of Joseph's, the idea that the United Firm would be a mercantile and printing company, that this would provide income for certain people, particularly the leaders, those people who were bringing forth these words of God. And that also included Martin Harris, because of course he had failed by this point to secure his farm, and so he was in quite a lot of desperation and a bit resentful that he had given so much and got so little from the church. And Joseph offered him the next project, or a run on the next project, which was him being involved in the printing of the Book of Commandments, the Revelations, and also the translation of the Bible. However, this united firm that had these stewards who were going to profit from this business, this completely failed by 1834. So yeah, lots of things that just did not work out. Did not work out for Joseph, but particularly did not work out for Martin, who had invested so much money and lost so much and could never quite recover. But the thing to understand is the Book of Mormon was there to provide a profit and really didn't. Then the Book of Commandments and the translation of the Bible was supposed to make a profit and didn't. These were the ideas that Joseph had, that people would be interested in revelation and scripture and words from God, and they would be willing to pay for them. And while it didn't work out like Joseph envisioned, or that the Revelation said that it would, it did kind of work out in that people did continue to sacrifice for their version of Mormonism and being a part of it through their resources. It's worth talking about the Book of Mormon because this is really the pivotal point around which the church starts in 1829 and 1830, and for which people anchor their faith. Remember, there is no first vision at this point in time. People are joining the church because of the Book of Mormon. It quickly becomes an anchor to their belief because it exists and it's something special in Western New York. Almost immediately, the idea that this is a miracle because a farm boy produced a book that you could read that had things that were connected to the Bible, that there was some idea that God was working in the lives of people again in a prophetic, evangelistic, inspired and spiritual way. These kinds of things captured the imagination of a lot of people. And for a lot of poor people, and particularly those who were New England refugees in Western New York who believed in folk magic, this was their text. The first 50 to 100 members of the church were from that culture. It legitimized their use of seer stones. It suggested that there were treasures under the ground, that the land was full of gold and silver just waiting to be dug up. These were really important underpinnings of treasure seeking in the area. And it was really a text about marginalized people because Joseph was marginalized. It spoke against lawyers, it spoke against the haughty, it spoke against the rich who were not sharing, and it talked a lot about the idea that people should impart their substance one to another. But the biggest thing was that it actually existed and that somebody lowly brought it forth. These were things that really appealed to people, particularly the marginalized. And at the same time, it caused a lot of conflicts because people of the time were very particular about their beliefs in the Bible, and the Book of Mormon challenged those quite dramatically. And so this was one of its selling points, but also it provided a lot of persecution as people realized that this was going against some of their core beliefs. It was compelling in the idea that there was some kind of miracle going on. The idea that this lowly boy could produce this great text was important, and these differences were accentuated over time because it made for a better story. Even today, we talk about the idea that the Book of Mormon is produced in 90 days by this person with a third grade education. But when you examine Joseph's life, he was very voracious in his learning, even though it wasn't that structured. And yes, the original manuscript was produced between basically April and June of 1829, which is approximately 90 days or 75 days worth of working time. But proponents ignore the idea that Joseph is in Palmyra July, August, September. He comes back in January and February, and so lots of revision can be made and improvements to the text. At the same time, Oliver Cowdery and Hiram Smith are working on the printer's manuscript and making improvements, which is from August right through to February, so 6 months worth of time working on the text. And then, of course, the printer's manuscript is going to the printer to Grandin, and because there's no punctuation in the text, it means that basically the printer has to make alterations to make sentence structures, to make grammatical corrections. These are all improvements to the text by the time it rolls off the press as a complete book in March of 1829 or 1830. Big AI asks this question: can you talk about the approximate 40,000 punctuations the printer added? Depending on how those punctuations were added, I believe it can change meanings in verses, and that's absolutely the case. The printer is going to have to make, calls on this, and of course, Oliver Cowdery and Hiram Smith are approving those. So these are all improvements to the text that is happening, and all of this is without talking about the first draft that is produced by Martin Harrison and Joseph Smith in 1828 between April and June. That's 2 months of time. So there is a lot of time going into making the Book of Mormon better and more cohesive and more understandable. And this continues throughout Joseph's life when they do a printing in 1837 and again in 1840. There are improvements that are done. There are chapters and verses that are added. And what we get today is, of course, a lot more polished than even what rolled off the printing press in March of 1830. And while the Book of Mormon appealed to marginalized settler Europeans, it did not appeal at all to Native Americans. And it did not appeal to particular religious. We see huge criticisms from people like Alexandra Campbell. It didn't appeal to any literary sense. We see major criticisms from notable authors like Mark Twain. It just is not the kind of book that you think is great. The biggest appeal of it is that it exists, not its actual text. We've talked a lot about how the stories of the Book of Mormon are really problematic, and particularly the Book of Ether with the Jaredite record. These things are just crazy unless you're just looking for something which appeals to your prejudice and helps you work to overcome your marginalization. And so it only appeals to a very small proportion of the population, and this is still the case some 200 years later. So by the end of May and into June of 1830, Joseph is back up in Fayette, New York. His 1838 history says that he's there with Newell Knight, who is Joseph Knight Sr.'s son. Apparently, Joseph Smith has cast out a devil out of Newell Knight, and this is the first miracle that happens in the church. Newell Knight testifies to this in this early June first conference of the church. And Newell Knight goes on to have a vision of the afterlife where he believes that he is saved, that he sees Jesus Christ, and this is all part of these ongoing prophecies and enlightenment that these early church members are attesting to. During this conference in early June, we see the other members of the Smith family get baptized. Jerusha Smith, who is Hiram's wife, Catherine Smith, William Smith, Don Carlos, and a number of neighbors of the Whitmers, because this is all happening in Fayette, New York. The contemporary documents we have of this time are from June the 9th, 1830, and these are the ordinations for John Whitmer, who is ordained an apostle elder. We have Joseph Smith Sr., who is ordained a priest, and then Christian Whitmer, who is ordained a teacher. At this point in time, there are only three offices: elder, priest, and teacher, as kind of defined by the Book of Mormon. And David Whitmer talks a lot about this in his address to all believers in 1881, and that this was a very simplified church, and that these other ideas of orders and offices of the priesthood that come later are an aberration. Now, there are already 6 elders of the church at this particular time, so John Whitmer being ordained to the office of an elder and designated as an apostle alongside Oliver Cowdery and Joseph Smith. These are really significant developments, and the idea that the church is now growing, that Joseph Smith Sr. is called on a mission to preach the gospel as a priest, and also that Christian Whitmer is to assist as a teacher. But other than all this, we don't have a lot of information about what is happening, where people are going, and who's going where, and with whom. But it looks like that David Whitmer, Oliver Cowdery, and John Whitmer have returned to Harmony, Pennsylvania with Joseph Smith, because they collect Emma Smith and go through to the Colesville branch in nearby New York. There are several people wanting to get baptized there, including Joseph Knight Sr.'s wife. They build a dam for baptism, but that is destroyed by some mobs and persecution, people who are opposed to people joining the church. And in that 1838 history, we hear of people who are sympathetic to the church and the gospel and wanting to be taught are kind of dissuaded by local ministers. But on the 28th of June, 1830, they're able to reinstate the dam, and Oliver Cowdery baptized 13 people, including, and most prominently, Emma Smith. But that evening, when they're supposed to be confirmed, a constable arrives at the house and arrests Joseph Smith. People have complained that Joseph has revived his glass-looking, his seer stone use, and he's using it to defraud people. So he goes before a justice of the peace, and many witnesses are called to talk about Joseph's seer stone use, his digging for money, and his defrauding of people in the area. We don't have great detail about the accusations and the testimony. We do have a bit, and generally even his friends talk about how he was money digging, but that he hadn't been doing this for several years. They talked about how he had now been using the seer stone in the hat with his face covered to produce and translate the Book of Mormon, and that this wasn't the same thing as he had been doing 4 years earlier. Newell Knight also talked about the idea that Joseph had cast a devil out of him, and that now Joseph was a prophet, somebody who was really special and doing the Lord's work. Subsequently, Joseph was discharged. He says that he's acquitted later in his history, but it's probably just discharged because there's not enough evidence to suggest that Joseph is using his seer stone to look for money like he had been several years earlier. The crowd in that area is not happy, so they basically rearrest him and take him to a neighboring county to try him on the same ideas. This constable manhandles Joseph, and he is really insulted, he's pressured, he's quite afraid. In his 1838 history, Joseph recounts this event as a lot more jovial than it was, and he says that the constable ended up apologizing to him because there was just no charge against him. And it seems like he was discharged again on this second charge in this neighbouring county. The same friends spoke for him, the same kind of testimony ensued, and the judge decided that there was just not enough evidence to suggest that Joseph was using his seer stone in a fraudulent way, at least, to dig for money and pretend to get people's finances. But this was all very disconcerting for Joseph, who, even though this happened in New York and he is living in nearby Pennsylvania in Harmony, this was the direct related area and he did not feel safe. It's the beginning of July, and after these two court cases, Joseph, Emma, Oliver Cowdery and John Whitmer have retreated back to the Harmony cottage next to the Hale farm. Remember that it looks like this. The cottage, Joseph has put a whole big salt house next to it. It's made it pretty much like a bit of a mansion. He's put on at least another 8 rooms onto his cottage. And so this is a big deal. This is something that he's incredibly proud of and he wants to see continue. But he's just been hauled into court and he's been roughed up by the law. This is really bad. Plus two, his cottage is on the main road into Harmony, Pennsylvania. He can't really hide. This is not a place that he can be incognito. The safety he thought he was going to have is now obliterated. Now you've got to remember that he's been having the time of his life up until this point. The church has been organised in April. He's been travelling around. He's been with his buddies. He's done lots of adventures. There's all this baptism going on. He's actually not been at home very much over the past year. And because of that, there's another big problem, and that is Emma has been keeping the household going with her dairy services, but there still needs to be some planting, some farming around the property. They haven't got any crops. This is now the middle of summer. They should have been doing stuff, but Joseph has been out on adventures. There is just not much to show physically and, in terms of wealth for his family. And so we see these 3 revelations, which are now section 24, 25, and 26 in the Doctrine and Covenants. And they're really addressing these concerns. They're the inner voice of Joseph projecting his fears. He tells himself that he's been chosen to write the Book of Mormon and to be a minister, and that he's been delivered from the powers of Satan and from darkness. But also that he has been wrong, that he's been sinning, and he needs to repent. But that he needs to sow his fields and secure them, but then go speedily to the church in Colesville and Fayette and Manchester, those 3 branches we talked about, and they shall support thee. The Book of Mormon talked a lot about priestcrafts, the idea that people shouldn't be supported in their ministry, that people should be able to work alongside others, and yet he's going against this in this section of Revelation. And there's a warning to those branches that if they don't support him, there's going to be a cursing on them. And he's supposed to devote all his service to Zion. In his temporal labours he shall not have strength, for that's not his calling. He's supposed to be supported by the church. This is priestcraft. This is what the Book of Mormon taught against. But he's got no other choice. He can't stay in his Harmony home. He's just not safe there. And the idea of cursing comes up again and again in this revelation. And cursing is the power of the marginalized, right? It's the thing which you do when you don't have any power and you can't have any recourse. So you use God's punishment as a cursing, as a way to make yourself feel good that God is on your side and that those wicked others are going to have their comeuppance. And you can see this in the text, whosoever shall lay their hands upon thee by violence, ye shall command to be smitten in their name, and behold, I will smite them in mine own good time. And whosoever shall go to the law with thee shall be cursed by the law. This is all marginalization speaking here. It's just in reaction to him going to court, to him being put upon, to the violence that's been perpetrated against him. This is all ways that Joseph is internalizing this and trying to find a way that God's going to fight on his behalf, because that'll make him feel less vulnerable. And the church, or these branches of the church, are going to provide for his needs, for his food and for his raiment. And he's there to prune the vineyard because this is the last time. It really feels so urgent for Joseph because he's really feeling vulnerable at this particular moment. And the next revelation, which is section 25, is along the same kind of vein, except that it's addressed to Emma Smith. Now, this is important, of course, because no women have been given revelations up until this time. It's really been a boys' club. Joseph is really talking about his friends, his boys, his posse, his people, and none of them have been women up until this moment. But obviously, Emma is feeling incredibly vulnerable after these last events in New York, and she is asking some really big questions about this whole movement that he needs to address and allay her fears, but also maybe put her in her place. She's told to walk in virtue. She's told to murmur not. And really, she's been a scribe for the Book of Mormon, and yet she wasn't chosen as a witness. She could never see the plates. So he's just giving her an excuse of why she's not been involved in this whole process. She's told that she's supposed to be a comfort for Joseph in his afflictions. And perhaps because she's been so excluded and she's been just left at home in Harmony while Joseph has been out having his boys' adventures, she's told that she's supposed to be a scribe, that she's going to be ordained under his hand, and that she's going to be expounding to the church, because she's an incredibly capable woman. And maybe she's saying, look, I don't want to have anything to do with this unless I'm involved, and you haven't involved me. And she's got fears too, right? Because she knows that the plants aren't in the ground. She knows they won't have food come winter. And so Joseph gets this revelation that he will be able to support her through the church. She's also told that she's going to be in charge of taking care of hymns and be able to be the music person for the church. But she's also told to beware of pride, that her soul needs to delight in her husband, and if she does this, she will get this crown of righteousness. So it's a bit of a carrot and stick revelation for Emma to put her in her place, but also to give her some hope. And of course, Joseph can't just leave her in Harmony. He's not safe there, so he's going to have to make a big move, and she's going to have to go with him, and she needs to support him in that, and not, falter. And the last revelation is section 26, which is written to Joseph, to Oliver Cowdery and John Whitmer. And really this is, they're all there in that house together in Harmony, wondering what to do, what the church is about. And I think there's probably some other interesting dynamics with regard to those other elders of the church. What is their place? Because Joseph has been taking the lead on a lot of these things, and that wasn't ever their understanding of how the church should come. It should be an egalitarian church. And so this revelation really seeks to bring them on board and also share power. So the idea that they should be devoted to the studying of the scriptures, that they should be succoring the branches of the church like in Colesville, and that everything should be done by common consent in the church. And this is a really big deal, because this suggests that it's supposed to be an egalitarian church, that Joseph is just not an island, that the power is supposed to be shared. And this is a really big deal for the church. It's also a really big deal for these first other witnesses who are the backbone of the church. What is their place in this new movement? And maybe they've been complaining to Joseph that he's been excluding them, that it's all been about him when it's supposed to be about God. This is going to play out really quickly in the piece with regard to things like revelations that other people get, including Hiram Page. And so it seems like the men all work together to get some crops in the ground, that they kind of hide out in Harmony while things calm down over the border into New York. And they're making plans to leave, because this place is not going to be the place that the church centers around. August 1830, and Joseph is still in Harmony, Pennsylvania. He talks about in his 1838 history that things are still a little bit tricky in terms of persecution, that there are some people, particularly a Methodist minister in the area, that is out to get Joseph. But he has a visit from Newell Knight, and his recently baptized wife. And because the wife and also Emma have not been confirmed in the church, they decide to have a service where they can partake of the sacrament and confirm their members. The setting is an intimate group of 5 with the 2 couples and John Whitmer. Joseph goes out to buy some wine for the sacrament, and then, according to him, he has a messenger tell him that there are people out to get him, that he needs to be wary of them, and also that actually it doesn't matter what you use in terms of the sacrament. It's any liquid is fine, and if you're going to use wine of your own make, therefore you know it's going to be safe and not poisoned. This seems to reflect that Joseph is still incredibly vulnerable in this era. He's feeling it incredibly, and he's having these kind of revelations to solve problems, which is he doesn't want to have to deal with other people if he can get away with it. Have a look at the text for section 27, suggesting that it mattereth not what you shall eat or drink when it comes to partaking of the sacrament, and that you should not purchase wine, neither strong drink of your enemies, that you should partake of none except it is made new among you. And pretty much that's the text of the original Revelation, but it was heavily added to in the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, when all of their understanding about Peter, James and John the Baptist and Moroni and all of those kind of ideas of heavenly messengers are put into this particular section. That's a discussion for another day, but just be aware that section 27, the original Revelation, is only really short, just a few verses. And because of this revelation, church members today justify using water in the sacrament, and this makes it all okay. Joseph, in his later recollection of his history in 1838, after Oliver Cowdery has been ousted from the church, talks about an incident in August of 1830 where he received a letter from Oliver Cowdery about a revelation where Oliver believed it was bordering on priestcraft. Joseph says that he wrote back to Oliver and told him that there's no way that he should alter the revelations of God. And again, this is a bit of an irony, because in August of 1830, we see this revelation, which is now section 27, being heavily altered by Joseph by 1835. But I digress. Anyway, it says that Joseph needed to go to Fayette and confront Oliver and the Whitmers about this and bring them in line. I can't find in the historical record that this trip happened, but it may have. We just don't know. It does seem to be conflated with some revelations a little bit later where Joseph says he has to correct Oliver and the Whitmers, particularly on the seer stone use of Hiram Page. But so this could be a conflation. But anyway, he's back in Harmony, Pennsylvania by the end of August because he has a special idea. He needs to go back to Colesville, and so he prays, and he says that he has this miraculous experience that when he goes there, he's protected, that people don't recognize him, that he's able to get in and out of Colesville and confirm the people who were baptized, who need to be in the church, and get out without anybody recognizing him or having any trouble. And he counts this to being a great miracle. And then at the very end of August and into September, he's back in Fayette, New York for a new conference of the church. By the 1st of September 1830, Joseph is back in Fayette, New York to preside over this new church conference that they're having basically every 2 months at this point. This is not just a quick trip. This is a move. Joseph and Emma have been relocated to the Whitmer farm by Peter Whitmer Sr. He's been alerted to the persecution they've been having in Harmony, and he said that it's okay for them to come and live with the Whitmers permanently. Around the same time, Joseph has orchestrated the move of his parents from Manchester, because effectively they are evicted, and moved them through to Waterloo, which is quite close to Fayette. They are in terrible poverty at this particular point. Joseph Smith Sr. has spent a little bit of time in debtor's prison because he just can't pay his bills. Joseph would also encourage his brother Hiram to leave the area too and come and join them in Waterloo. But when Joseph gets to Fayette, he finds out that Hiram Page has been receiving revelations in his seer stone. He recounts in his 1838 history that Hiram Page is getting revelations about Zion and church governance, because remember, these people think that it's egalitarian. They believe that they all have access to revelation and that they can get it and it can inform the church. Both David Whitmer and Hiram Page have seer stones, and so they feel completely confident in getting revelation. But this is a massive threat to Joseph's preeminence in this church, and so he stamps on it pretty hard. Section 28 records this, and the idea that Hiram Page is told by Oliver Cowdery that he needs to stop. Firstly, Oliver is told that Joseph is the person who's going to get the revelations and that nobody else can speak for the church but him. Oliver can say what he's directed to by the Holy Spirit, but it's not binding. But Oliver's got a charge to go to the Lamanites in Indian territory and preach the gospel unto them. And that no one knows where the city of Zion should be built, but it will be given hereafter. Oliver's told that he needs to go to Hiram Page and tell him that the stone which he's receiving these revelations in is being controlled by Satan and he's deceiving him. Later, there's a story that the stone is destroyed, but this is not the case. Both Hiram Page's stone and David Whitmer's stone is retained by the community of Christ. But Joseph succeeds in convincing Oliver Cowdery and the Whitmers to put down their seer stones and rely on Joseph's own word. It's really interesting, though, if you read Address to All Believers by David Whitmer later in 1881, he talks about throughout the whole thing that he believes that the revelations that Joseph got through his seer stone right through to April 1830 were correct, and that Joseph started to err and become important and above everybody else and stopped using his seer stone, and this is why the church fell into corruption. Section 29, that revelation is received by 6 elders at Fayette, including many of the Whitmers. And it really talks about the last days and the idea that the elect are going to be gathered and there's going to be tribulation because Jesus is coming really soon. It also talks about the great and abominable church, which is, as we've talked about before, a real prejudice of the Whitmers, and this revelation is given to them that the abominable church is around and it's going to have a great fall. Section 30 is 3 revelations to David Whitmer, Peter Whitmer Jr. and John Whitmer, also talking about their responsibility in this new church. And part of these revelations, Peter Whitmer is given the charge to go with Oliver to preach to the Lamanites and find the New Jerusalem. Section 31 is a revelation in the same conference to Thomas B. Marsh, who has recently joined the church, and he rises to prominence quite quickly, and you'll see later that he becomes the president of the Quorum of the 12. By the end of September, the men are organizing to go to Zion, to Indian territory, to preach to the Lamanites, and Section 32 gives a charge to Parley P. Pratt and Ziba Peterson to join Oliver Cowdery and Peter Whitmer. This is just another treasure dig. The idea that Joseph is sending out 4 people, just like the other examples that we've already had a look at. And Oliver publishes a covenant in early October in the local paper, talking about his charge to preach to the Lamanites and also to establish Zion, to get a revelation about where that is. This is a treasure dig. So later into October, they are sent out to go to Indian territory. They have real problems there, and they're not really allowed to teach the Native Americans, and so actually Zion becomes independence, and these revelations are changed to, instead of among the Lamanites, to on the borders of the Lamanites. And then Section 33 is received also in October for Ezra Thane and Northrop Sweet to go as missionaries to teach, and this never happens because these people don't stay in the church. But Joseph is making his mark on this new church and also neutralizing potential threats and sending out competitors like Oliver Cowdery to do important work somewhere else where he doesn't have to be a threat to the leadership. So the biggest thing to happen in the end of 1830 is that Sidney Rigdon, who is a minister in Ohio, gets converted by those missionaries who end up going through Ohio on their way to Indian Territory. Parley P. Pratt was a former adherent of Sidney Rigdon, and he introduced the Book of Mormon to him, and Sidney Rigdon and Edward Partridge both came on a trip to New York and met Joseph and were enamored by him. But first off, we have section 34, which is a revelation to Orson Pratt, Parley P. Pratt's younger brother, who's 19 at the time, and he's commanded to preach the gospel. This revelation was on November 4th, 1830, and it follows a lot of the rhetoric of Joseph's revelations of the time, the idea that Christ is coming imminently and people need to be sent out to preach and warn people and bring them into the truth. And by the beginning of December 1830, Sidney Rigdon and Edward Partridge have arrived in Fayette and met Joseph, and they are completely besotted with each other. Joseph soon gives Sidney Rigdon a revelation, a calling to be his scribe, particularly because he's working on the translation of the Bible at this time. And the revelation in the voice of God really elevates Joseph, that he's something special, and Sidney should pay attention and become his scribe, because scriptures will be given through him with Sidney's help. Joseph also gives a revelation to Edward Partridge, telling him what a great man the Lord thinks he is, and that if he's willing to support Joseph and Sidney, he will be blessed and saved from the generation. And then Joseph goes on to get revelations in December, talking about the church moving to Ohio and Joseph joining Sidney and Edward Partridge there. There's a church conference in early January. Part of the conference is a revelation, a commandment to go to the Ohio. People with farms should rent them out or sell them, but they need to go now. As part of this conference, they also encounter a man named James Covell, who is a Methodist minister, and Joseph gives him a revelation that he has to follow Joseph. But unlike Sidney Rigdon and Edward Partridge, he just totally thinks Joseph is milking it, that he's a false prophet, and he completely, distances himself. Joseph had got a revelation for him, telling him how special he was and how the Lord needed him. But then he needed to get a new revelation, basically to tell James Covell and to explain that the Lord had called him, but now the Lord was going to have to deal with him because he hadn't done what he had been told to do in this revelation. And with that, at the end of January 1831, Joseph moves his family through to Ohio. They're basically homeless anyway. They're kind of squatting with the Whitmers. So this is a good break and a needed one, considering that Joseph is facing persecution and he needs a way out. And this elevates Sidney Rigdon in a huge way to Joseph's right-hand man. And because Sidney Rigdon has a charge over those people in Ohio and he's bringing them into the church, he becomes really important really quickly. In fact, you can trace many of the next iterations of the church to Sidney Rigdon and his influence over Joseph, particularly as they work on the new translation of the Bible and come up with revelations and understandings and theology that are more aligned with Sidney Rigdon and that Joseph adopts as he brings the church and the people from Fayette and Colesville and Manchester through to Ohio.